start with the book. Maybe you can tell us a little bit uh, behind, the inspiration for writing it, some of the struggles, the ethical struggles that you dealt with in publishing it, and some of the consequences that you might be dealing with now after having published that about 3 years ago.
Well, 4 years ago, there weren't that many people calling the president dangerous. And since my work has mainly been in preventing danger and preventing violence, violence is the end product of a long process where there are many points at which we could intervene and prevent dangers, and the signs were all there. And so mental health expertise was particularly important because unlike what most people believe, we don't just diagnose mental illness all the time. We actually more often, and in fact with every encounter, assess dangerousness. And the dangers to self, to others, and to the public are accessible not only through a personal interview, but through any kind of information that we can obtain. And as long as we have enough information, we have a societal duty to intervene.
It's so interesting, and I would love to get into some more of these details because so many people think, that there's not a connection, right? That the kind of example that the president leads is not causing people to be more violent. Like they don't tend to see the connection. And I was reading recently, like Malcolm Gladwell's Tipping Point, and maybe he got this example from your textbook, I'm not sure, but he was talking about the cultures of violence. And he gave an example of like maybe back early in the 1900s, how trains that had graffiti on them, how there was all this incidences of violence happening on these trains. But once they started to clean up the graffiti and they started to show that we care about this infrastructure, that the violence decreased, and that somehow the graffiti was giving people the signals that, you're all alone, you have to take care of yourself, and you're living kind of in this kind of survival mode. And people began to act out more violently because of these kind of cultural impressions. And so we don't tend to see violence as like a product of a cultural milieu. And, you've done work with at Rikers Island. Maybe that would be a good example to talk about. But what are some examples of like, how are these milieux created and what are some of the factors that kind of lead to the erupting point?
Yes, given the work that I have been involved with since violence was declared as a public health problem and a public health emergency at the time in the mid to late 1990s, I have come to view it as a societal disorder. And I think that is really a much better way to conceive of it, as a societal mental disorder, not an individual one. Also, I would like to note that mental illness, individual mental illness by itself does not make anyone any more dangerous than someone without mental illness. So the common popular association between mental illness and dangerousness is actually untrue. But it is true at a societal level. We tend to think of individuals as being separate from one another, and we are just too individualized in our thinking that we miss the connections. But the fact is that violent individuals in particular are very suggestible, and they adopt certain means of defending themselves or trying to protect themselves, as you were saying, because that is how they learned they should behave through various signals that come through the culture. So you mentioned how we often miss the connection between the president's speech and words and the violent actions. In fact, when it comes to individual acts of violence, giving someone orders or causing someone to commit violence, it's not as influential at the individual level as it is at the societal level. Someone in an influential position speaking in ways that are known to instigate violence. For example, dehumanizing entire groups of people, such as calling immigrants invaders, or calling them animals. Those kinds of rhetoric are actually known to cause epidemics of violence and even genocide in many countries. One of the ones I've studied includes Rwanda, where all began with simply identifying a group of people with animals. Other things include how Donald Trump appeals to the sense of inferiority or lack or powerlessness in the population by enlisting them, stating that, you know, you would be a true American and truly patriotic if you do what I say. And then he goes on to say, we are strong, we should not be weak, we should save the country, save the democracy, and here are the people you should target. Then there could be very few orders that are as powerful as that. And among the symptoms that spread rapidly in a population include delusions or fixed false beliefs that are not amenable to facts and evidence or reason, paranoia or believing that a threat exists where it does not, and violence proneness. So violence is very contagious. So these are the symptoms that are very transmissible, especially when they occur in a person of great influence. And who could have greater influence than the President of the United States?
What was like the tipping point for you that said, I need to write this, or I need to collect these essays from these different mental health professionals? Because I'm sure, and maybe you can describe a little bit about this, that in your profession, as well as probably in your faith, there's a virtue to being nonpartisan, right? And to make a stand like this, immediately puts you into the partisan party lines, where people are assuming that you're just a liberal Democrat who's against the president. I mean, so what were some of the challenges that you faced maybe on those fronts of taking an action and then being labeled as this partisan ally? And then what was the tipping point for you saying, I have to write this book because it's my duty or my ethical obligation to do so?
Yes, thanks for asking that question, because it was actually easy for me. I had not been involved in partisan politics at all in the past. I mean, I voted during presidential elections only, and I was doing mostly global work. And so domestic politics seemed rather trivial compared to trying to prevent wars or civil wars or gender-based violence around the world. So I was purely responding to what I saw as a medical need. And you asked what the tipping point was. It was actually a call from the public. I had just helped to bring in federal investigation of Rikers Island for subculture of violence, and I had written a report about the violence in the prisons. And so a lot of the civil society members already knew about me. The morning after the presidential election of 2016, I was inundated with calls, with messages, with emails from members of the public, lawyers, civil society members, documentary filmmakers, those who were concerned about the dangers that were to come with this presidency, the violence that was to come. I think they were thinking mainly of hate crimes, but also some were mentioning about the dangers to the environment in terms of nuclear war, and they knew about how I connected all these types of violence. As in my textbook that you had just mentioned, It's an interdisciplinary textbook that brings together all the different forms of violence and how they are interconnected. So the fact that we had elected a dangerous president was not so much just an individual issue of Donald Trump. It was a public health issue and also a statement about our general state of collective mental health, as well as the potential for all different forms of violence that would affect society. Violent incidents are not random, and they are actually, the incidents themselves are usually incidental, meaning, they may or may not occur depending on the circumstances at that very moment, and that can always change. But the proneness to violence, the violent propensities in the culture, in the individual, have long been there, and so having a violence-prone president in the midst of an increasingly violent culture was like lighting a match to gasoline and allowing the destructive traits to spread. And that's what caused the violent insurrection of last week.